There are war movies, and then there's Apocalypse Now. Released in 1979, Francis Ford Coppola's fever dream journey up the Nung River didn't just capture the madness of Vietnam, it practically became it. This was the film that felt less like a production and more like a primal event, something that crawled out of the jungle fully formed and half crazed. It changed what cinema could be. It changed what cinema could cost a director, financially, physically, emotionally, and decades later, it still holds you hostage in the dark. Today, we're counting down 13 weird facts you didn't know about Apocalypse Now. Number 13, the film that almost starred half of Hollywood before Martin Sheen ever set foot in that Saigon hotel room. Apocalypse Now was the hottest script nobody could figure out how to cast. And the list of actors who were considered, approached, or nearly signed is so staggering, it reads less like a casting sheet and more like a who's who of 1970s Hollywood royalty. Steve McQueen was Coppola's original dream for Captain Willard, the quiet, coiled, morally hollowed-out soldier sent to assassinate a rogue colonel. McQueen was interested, genuinely interested, but he had conditions. He didn't want to spend months. Can't entirely blame him. When that fell apart, the role went to Harvey Keitel, who actually began filming. Keitel shot for several weeks before Coppola made the difficult decision to recast him. It wasn't about talent. Keitel was formidable, but Coppola felt the character needed a different kind of stillness, a passivity, a man disappearing into the mission rather than pushing against it. Martin Sheen stepped in and delivered one of the most haunting performances ever committed to film. But here's the thing, even Jack Nicholson and Al Pacino had been in the conversation at various points. The film that exists only exists because of a cascade of near misses, and every single alternate version of it would have been a completely different movie. Number 12. Marlon Brando showed up unprepared and overweight, and Coppola had to improvise everything. When Marlon Brando finally arrived in the Philippines to film his role as the enigmatic, terrifying Colonel Kurtz, the production faced a crisis that had nothing to do with typhoons or equipment failures. Brando had not read Heart of Darkness, the Joseph Conrad novella that forms the backbone of the story. He had not read the script thoroughly, and he had arrived significantly heavier than anyone had anticipated, a fact that directly contradicted the character's described physical presence as a lean, almost ascetic figure. Now, any other director might have panicked. Coppola, to his credit, leaned in. The decision to keep Brando almost entirely in shadow, that iconic darkness, those half-lit cheekbones, the sense of a man who has become more concept than person, was born directly from practical necessity. They simply could not light Brando the way the script originally envisioned. What emerged from those improvised sessions became some of the most memorable footage in cinema history. Brando and Coppola spent hours in conversation, essentially building the character collaboratively on set. The rambling, poetic monologue, the quiet horror of Kurtz's worldview, much of it was developed in real time. A catastrophe became a masterpiece through sheer force of creative adaptation. That's either inspiring or terrifying, depending on how you look at it. Number 11, the production was so chaotic, it inspired its own documentary. Most films get a making-of featurette, a few minutes of behind-the-scenes footage, some talking heads, maybe a blooper reel. Apocalypse Now got Hearts of Darkness, a filmmaker's apocalypse. A full-length documentary that is, by almost any measure, as compelling as the film itself. What makes it extraordinary is the footage. Eleanor Coppola, Francis's wife, had been filming behind the scenes throughout the entire production. She wasn't doing it for promotional purposes. She was documenting what she could see happening, the unraveling of her husband, the chaos of the set, the impossible conditions, the money hemorrhaging out at a terrifying rate. What she captured was essentially a filmmaker having a very public, very expensive breakdown in slow motion. In the documentary, Coppola admits on camera that he genuinely didn't know how the film ended. He says with a kind of exhausted honesty that is almost painful to watch, that he had too much money, too much equipment, and was going slowly insane. The production had been shut down by a typhoon that destroyed sets. Martin Sheen suffered a near-fatal heart attack on location. The budget ballooned from an initial estimate of around $12 million to somewhere in the neighborhood of $31 million, with Coppola mortgaging his own personal assets to keep it going. The documentary didn't release until 1991, more than a decade after the film, but when it did, it reframed everything audiences thought they understood about what making a movie actually costs. Number 10, Martin Sheen had a real heart attack during filming. This isn't rumor. This isn't exaggeration for dramatic effect. Martin Sheen suffered an actual heart attack during the production of Apocalypse Now, and the circumstances surrounding it are as complicated and difficult as everything else about this film. Sheen was 36 years old at the time. The production had been going for months. The conditions in the Philippines were brutal. The heat, the humidity, the physical demands of the shoot, and the psychological weight of inhabiting a character who was himself coming apart at the seams. Sheen had also been dealing with significant personal struggles during the production, and the cumulative toll caught up with him. He collapsed on location and had to be treated on the ground, miles from adequate medical facilities. For a period of time, the production genuinely did not know whether to survive. Coppola was reportedly so concerned about the film's future and so aware of the financial catastrophe that losing Sheen would trigger that he initially kept the severity of the heart attack from reaching the press. The official line was that Sheen had suffered from heat exhaustion. The full story only emerged later. Sheen recovered. He returned to the film. He finished the performance. And knowing what he went through to complete it adds a layer to every scene he appears in that you simply cannot unknow once you learn it. The exhaustion in his eyes is not entirely acting. Number 9. The famous hotel room opening was partially real. The film opens with one of the most striking sequences in cinema. Willard drunk and dissociating in a Saigon hotel room, breaking a mirror, smearing blood across his face, weeping with a kind of grief that feels too specific to be performed. It's raw and disturbing and almost unwatchable in the best possible way. And here's the thing about that scene. A significant portion of what you're seeing is not scripted behavior. Martin Sheen arrived to film that opening genuinely intoxicated. This was, by various accounts, something he had decided to do in order to access what the character was going through. The physical breakdown, the dancing, the confrontation with his own reflection. Coppola kept the cameras rolling and essentially filmed what unfolded. When Sheen punched the mirror and cut his hand, that was real blood, real injury. Coppola's decision to keep rolling rather than call cut gave the scene its unbearable authenticity. Sheen has spoken about that day with a mixture of pride and discomfort. It was not a responsible or repeatable approach to filmmaking, but it produced something that no amount of careful choreography could have manufactured. The character of Willard needed to feel like a man who had already lost something fundamental before the story even begins. And that opening scene delivers exactly that, because, in a sense, what you're watching actually happened. Number 8. Dennis Hopper was genuinely out of his mind on set. Here's a fact that blurs the line between behind-the-scenes anecdote and on-screen reality in a way that only Apocalypse Now could manage. Dennis Hopper, who plays the manic, babbling photojournalist who has essentially gone native in Kurtz's compound, was reportedly in an extremely altered state during much of his filming. Hopper's character in the film is chaotic, unpredictable, rambling, and fizzing with a kind of desperate energy that seems to have no off switch. The performance feels like a man who has been awake for 4 days and found enlightenment and terror in equal measure. That quality, that specific frantic vibration, it was not entirely a performance. Coppola has discussed the challenge of working with Hopper during this period. Getting usable takes was difficult. The energy was genuine but uncontrollable, and the line between Hopper the actor and Hopper the character became extremely thin. There's a specific kind of irony in the fact that a film about people losing themselves to an environment and an ideology featured an actor who was, to some degree, genuinely lost. His scenes remain mesmerizing, uncomfortable and funny and frightening all at once, and they work precisely because something real is flickering underneath them. Whether that's a triumph of casting or a cautionary tale is probably both. Number 7. The Playboy Bunny scene was almost cut entirely. The sequence in Apocalypse Now, where the crew stops at a remote USO outpost and encounters a Playboy centerfold show that descends into near riot, is one of the film's most memorable detours. It's funny and sad and deeply strange, and it captures something true about the absurdity of the American military presence in Vietnam in a way that straightforward combat footage never could. The helicopter landing, the Hugh Hefner-approved surrealism of it all. It feels like a fever dream dropped into the middle of a nightmare. What many people don't know is that this sequence nearly disappeared from the film entirely. During editing, Coppola struggled enormously with the film's length and structure. Apocalypse Now exists in multiple cuts: the original 1979 theatrical release, the extended Redux version released in 2001, which added nearly an hour of footage, and the final cut from 2019. The Redux cut famously reinserted the French plantation sequence, a long, dreamlike encounter with a French colonial family still living in denial of the war around them, which had been cut from the 1979 release. Many critics consider it essential, others feel it stops the film dead. The fact that these two radically different versions of the same movie both exist and both have passionate defenders says everything about how genuinely unresolved Apocalypse Now remains as a piece of art. Number 6, the Cannes premiere was a spectacle of doubt. In May 1979, Apocalypse Now arrived at the Cannes Film Festival in a state that could charitably be described as unfinished. Coppola screened the film, still without a final sound mix, still without locked picture in places, and then stood in front of the international press and said something that has gone down in film history as either an act of stunning honesty or spectacular self-sabotage. He told the assembled journalists and critics that the film was not a movie about Vietnam. It was Vietnam.
Film is not about Vietnam. It is Vietnam.
He spoke about the chaos, the waste, the moral confusion, the money disappearing into the jungle. He compared the experience of making it to the American experience of fighting the war. He said he wasn't sure it was finished, or even if it could be finished. Critics were divided. Some found the statement profound and the film visionary. Others felt it was a director attempting to pre-excuse a flawed work with philosophical framing. What nobody could argue was that the film had no impact. Apocalypse Now shared the Palme d'Or that year, a tie with Volker Schlendorf's The Tin Drum, which itself felt appropriate. A film that couldn't decide what it was sharing the highest honor with another film about the impossibility of innocence. The Cannes moment became part of the mythology, and the mythology became inseparable from the film itself. Number 5, the napalm speech wasn't in the original script. I love the smell of napalm in the morning. It is one of the most quoted lines in American cinema. It has been reprinted on merchandise, parodied in hundreds of other films and television shows, and deployed in cultural conversations so often that many people who have never seen Apocalypse Now know it by heart. Robert Duvall delivers it as Lieutenant Colonel Kilgore with a kind of beatific, sun-drenched serenity that makes it genuinely chilling, because Kilgore isn't performing, he means it completely. Here's the thing about that speech, and specifically that line. The version of the Kilgore monologue that ended up in the film evolved significantly from what was on the written page. John Milius, who wrote the screenplay, had drafted versions of the beach assault sequence, but the specific poetry of that napalm speech developed through the collaboration between Milius, Coppola, and Duvall during production. Duvall, for his part, brought an athletic, almost evangelical physical presence to Kilgore that transformed what could have been a cartoonish warmonger into something genuinely troubling. A man so at home in destruction that he's achieved a kind of terrible peace. The surfing obsession, the Wagner blasting from helicopter speakers, the complete indifference to incoming fire, all of it coalesced into one of cinema's great supporting performances. Duvall received an Academy Award nomination for the role, which, given everything going on in that film, is a testament to how completely he owned every single second he was on screen. Number 4, John Milius based the screenplay on his own obsessions and a war he never fought. And John Milius is one of the more fascinating figures in 1970s Hollywood. A self-described Zen anarchist, a passionate surfer, an ardent admirer of military history, who was declared unfit for service due to asthma, and spent the Vietnam era channeling his complicated feelings about war into some of the most viscerally powerful screenwriting of the decade. He wrote Apocalypse Now from a place of genuine ideological wrestling, and it shows. Milius had been developing the project for years before Coppola became involved. He had read Heart of Darkness and immediately recognized something in Conrad's story about a man sent to confront a brilliant, monstrous figure who had gone beyond the reach of civilization, something that mapped onto the Vietnam experience in ways that felt both inevitable and deeply uncomfortable. What's remarkable about the screenplay is its ambivalence. Milius was not making an anti-war film in the conventional sense, and he said as much. He found the darkness of Kurtz's logic, if not sympathetic, then at least worthy of a genuine hearing. That tension between condemning and being seduced by the very thing you're depicting is what gives Apocalypse Now its enduring unease. The film never entirely decides whether Kurtz is a monster or a prophet, and Milius built that irresolution into the foundation deliberately. A man who never went to war wrote the defining American statement about one. Make of that what you will. Number 3, the water buffalo sacrifice was real. This is the fact that stops people cold every time it comes up, and it deserves to be handled carefully. Near the end of Apocalypse Now, there is a ritual slaughter of a water buffalo, a carabao, intercut with the killing of Kurtz. The editing creates a parallel that is among the most powerful sequences in the film. It is also completely real. The Ifugao people, the indigenous community who served as the film's extras and provided much of the cultural authenticity of the Kurtz compound sequences, performed an actual ritual slaughter during filming. This was a real ceremony. The animal was genuinely killed. Coppola chose to include the footage in the film rather than cut around it or simulate it. This decision has generated ethical debate ever since. Animal rights advocates have objected strenuously. Others have argued that the ceremony was a genuine cultural practice, not staged cruelty, and that its inclusion in the film reflects a commitment to depicting reality rather than sanitizing it. The MPAA rating at the time did not penalize the film for this footage in the way it might penalize violence involving humans, a disparity that itself generated commentary. Whatever your position on that debate, the footage has a weight that no practical effect could replicate. You feel the reality of it, and in a film that is constantly asking you to confront the reality beneath the myth of war, perhaps that was always the point. Number 2, the film's ending was changed multiple times, and Coppola still isn't sure he got it right. The ending of Apocalypse Now has been a subject of debate since the film first screened. How do you end a story like this? How do you bring a man back from the heart of darkness, or decide that he can't come back? What does it mean when Willard finally does what he was sent to do? The film answers these questions in a way that feels simultaneously inevitable and deeply unresolved, and that's not an accident. Coppola shot multiple endings. One version ended with an enormous explosion, Willard calling in an airstrike on the entire compound, a kind of apocalyptic cleansing that would have given the film its most literal interpretation of its title. This ending was screened for some early audiences and generated strong reactions. Coppola ultimately stepped back from it, feeling it was too neat, too satisfying in the wrong way. War, this film argues, does not resolve. It simply continues at a different frequency. The ending that remains in the film, Willard emerging from the water, killing Kurtz, and then quietly walking away as the indigenous fighters lower their weapons, is ambiguous in a way that has fueled conversation for decades. Is it liberation? Corruption? Has Willard become the next Kurtz? Or has he escaped that fate? The famous last shot of the film, in the theatrical cut, leaves you in the dark in every sense. And Coppola has said in interviews across the years that he made peace with not having a definitive answer because the story doesn't have one, and pretending otherwise would have been a lie. Number 1, the film destroyed and remade. Francis Ford Coppola, simultaneously. By any rational measure, Apocalypse Now should not exist. The conditions that produced it, the flooded sets, the typhoon that wiped out weeks of work, the actor's heart attack, the star who arrived unprepared, the budget that swallowed Coppola's personal fortune, the production that stretched from a planned 6 weeks into more than a year of filming. Any one of those disasters, by itself, would have ended most productions. All of them together should have been unsurvivable. Coppola had arrived in the Philippines at the height of his powers. The Godfather and The Godfather Part 2 had made him arguably the most celebrated director in the world. He had the credibility, the connections, and initially the backing to make whatever he wanted. By the time Apocalypse Now was finished, he had mortgaged his winery, his home, and his financial future to keep the film alive. He had aged visibly. He had, by his own admission, frightened the people closest to him. And yet, the film he delivered is one of the great works of American cinema. It changed how filmmakers thought about what was possible in a war film, in a literary adaptation, in a meditation on morality and civilization. The man who broke himself, making it also, in breaking himself, made something that will outlast almost everything else from his era. That's not an endorsement of suffering as a creative method. It's just the truth of what happened. Apocalypse Now is the film it is because of everything it cost, and Coppola paid every single cent of that price himself.